1 in 15 officers roughly will experience depression at some point in their career throughout their life. And these will have adverse impacts on them. And so law enforcement profession, criminal justice, first responders, everybody in this industry and arena is really looking at the data to say, how can we provide overall mental health and wellness for our employees?
Welcome to Self Heal with Dr. Irene, where you'll learn powerful tools from world-class experts to heal yourself in all areas of your life, your health and energy, relationships, career, finances, and more. Welcome to Self Heal Podcast with Dr. Irene. And today I have a very special guest. I know I say that every single time, and this guest is even more specialer to me that for many reasons. Number one, she is an amazing friend that even though we've never physically met, I feel like she's my sister. And I have the greatest respect and admiration for her journey, and for the transformation that she is helping bring about in her part of the world. So let me tell you a little bit about Jonni Redick. Jonni has overseen a large civil disturbance, natural disaster response coordination, and the oversight and management of hundreds of personnel within daily operations of a multi-billion-dollar law enforcement organization. She's a 29-year veteran of the police force, rising through the ranks of the California Highway Patrol, from county clerical worker to breaking through that less than 1% ceiling for women of color in executive leadership in law enforcement. So in other words, very rarefied up there, folks. Her progression from frontline police work to executive leadership generated her passion for cultivating trust and legitimacy in organizational cultures. She now builds 21st century leaders as the founder and CEO of JL Consulting Solutions, where she works with police executives in law enforcement and public safety, CEOs in corporate, government, and nonprofit businesses. Currently, she is also adjunct faculty for the University of San Diego, instructing for the MS Law Enforcement and Public Safety Leadership Program, instructing leaders from across the country. Her training and instructional background includes work in cultural diversity, procedural justice, implicit bias, organizational culture, stress resiliency, public trust, and legitimacy. Jonni is also the author of The Survival Guide to Law Enforcement Promotional Preparation and her new book, Black, White, and Blue, Surviving the Sifting. Can you see why she's so amazing? Thank you so much for being here, Jonni.
Yes, thank you, Irene. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. I am very excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
Well, it's a mutual admiration of society. That's all I
Yes.
can say. Now, I know that there are so many conversations that we can have that fit the realm of self-healing and what is needed within your scope of leadership, culture training, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and go on and on and on. And one of the areas that I really wanted to focus on today with you is the self-healing that police officers and others in the organization need to do for themselves, for their families, for really the whole community. And so I know we were talking about the challenges that our responders face in terms of trauma and in terms of everything that they experience and what the job expects of them. So could you expand on that, please, Jonni?
Thank you for having this conversation about self-healing and for us to give focus to first responders and law enforcement. And I don't know that the general public realizes the cumulative trauma that, first responders and law enforcement experience on a daily basis, but then accumulate that over a 20 or 30-year career. And so there's research that shows that law enforcement officers will have an experience or witness a trauma more than 180 times throughout their career. And that can vary depending on their assignment. So they could have more or less. The experience alone that they have with seeing, death, for example, if they're called to calls in homes where, someone has just died and become deceased, or somebody has become a victim of a violent crime, those exposures over time are very traumatic. And what we're discovering in law enforcement is something that has been talked about for, some decades. It's just we're getting to this point where we need to implement some solutions, is looking at the psychological safety of our first responders and law enforcement versus just their physical safety, which is something that we've always, taught and trained on in academies. And when we look at, overall suicides, for example, in law enforcement specifically, they're high and they keep increasing every year. And they're starting to do research to follow the data on that. And additionally, underlying from suicide is often depression. And I mean, this is, for everybody in the world, but when you look at officers, that rate of depression is significantly higher for them than it is for average citizens. In fact, 1 in 15 officers roughly will experience depression at some point in their career throughout their life. And these will have adverse impacts on them. And so law enforcement profession, criminal justice, first responders, everybody in this industry and arena is really looking at the data to say, how can we provide overall mental health and wellness for our employees, preventative when it's happening, and well beyond that, not only for them and for what kind of family support can be provided as well. And so this is a very important area because, again, it has been something that's been talked about in research for a long time, but yet there's still not hard and fast data on actual law enforcement. And we know that things manifest just like they do in us as a person when we're experiencing these things, on how we will then interact or engage with others. And so it's extremely important that we continue to have these conversations and talk about the solutions for the work that needs to be done.
Absolutely. And there really is a stigma for these first responders and officers to admit to having any feelings of depression or other mental health concerns, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, stigma is one of the biggest barriers. There's been a lot of research by the Police Research Foundation, also the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and some other organizations doing the work. And the stigma surrounding it is officers don't want to feel weak. They don't want to be seen as broken. Also, internally in an organization, there's processes. Once you identify if somebody has a psychological, issue or a mental health issue, there's a concern immediately. Are they going to be suicidal? Will they take their life because they have firearms? And so some agencies have a remove the firearm policy when they discover, officers who are reporting mental health or psychological issues. There's also, they get put on administrative leave. That means they can no longer do their job until they've been seen by a clinician, and then they're, approved to be released back to work. And so that's very stressful for employees. They don't want to have to lose their livelihood. They don't want to not be able to be the provider for their family. They want to be able to continue to do the work, but they need help. Also on top of this, the stigma becomes other things like vices. Alcoholism is very high for us in law enforcement specifically. Also, divorce rates are high. All of these things can be attributed to depression, mental health issues, cumulative trauma when they're not getting the assistance that they need. And then, of course, we know there's physiological and physical things that can occur as well. But, that stigma is the big one to keep them from reaching out to get the help they need. So some of the things that are in place are like peer support. Law enforcement agencies and first responders have a peer support program within their organizations. And these are often peers that have experienced something similar to what the employee is. So they can choose the type of peer that they can interact with, so they can have somebody who's relatable and can understand. It's confidential. There's also employee assistance programs in most organizations that provide services from clinical services to all the things for finances. Maybe there might be other things relative to family issues or challenges for you to need counseling. So they provide these levels of support. And then agencies are starting to build in more and more of things that I think are extremely important, are discussions on mindfulness practices, also building in yoga, also building in more emotional intelligence and resiliency training. And this is all relatively new for law enforcement and first responders.
And I'm glad that they are starting to bring in the mindfulness and the yoga and the emotional intelligence and resiliency on top of the peer support and the EAPs. And there can also be a different kind of stigma with those, right?
Yeah.
That I'll pick on the macho stereotype that's for girls.
I will tell you, Irene, that yes, we have a lot of men who are uh, perceptions are everything, right? But I will tell you, there's this interesting thing that happens in law enforcement, and I'm speaking from my own lens. So first responders may have that if they're paramedics or EMTs or any firefighters, but I'm speaking from the law enforcement perspective, because we not only go in to help, we also place ourselves in danger physically, and we carry a firearm, which most other first responders do not do. So it is a very different dynamic that, when you're asking somebody to do yoga or mindfulness practices, it's hard for them to let their armor down to want to engage in these things again, because they don't want to be seen as not the warrior that they think they're supposed to be every day when they go out, versus we really want to move from warrior to guardian, because that is what our society is seeking from us in our services. Unfortunately, oftentimes our training on tactical training outweighs any of our behavioral training that we do. And so therefore you have officers that when they go out, their mindset is for them to return safe and try to keep everybody else safe in all their interactions. When in actuality, when you go out, it's really to be of service. We are to protect and to serve, but the serve part often gets forgotten. And that's where I think we need to continue to do the behavioral work and the emotional intelligence, which allows the armor to come down, some healing to take place in these spaces that they've had, they've been guarded in. We are very cynical in policing. So we do this guarded cynicism because we're constantly hyper vigilant, constantly assessing. We're always on. Firefighters, do an amazing job, but they get to be off. So they respond to a call and then they get to go back to the firehouse and be down. They respond to a call, they get to go back to the firehouse and they get downtime. Officers are on all shift long. They don't have a firehouse to go back to. Their calls for service are continuous, and it's one call to another, not knowing what to expect. So they're constantly hyper vigilant. And it takes a lot to decompress when you get off of work with your family. Sometimes your family won't understand. And if you've experienced a lot of cumulative trauma, maybe in the month, maybe in that week, maybe even in that day, one of the things that often happens is we will shut down. We will isolate ourselves. We don't want to make a lot of big decisions because we had to make decisions all day at work. We might get with a couple of friends and we might have some downtime where we kind of chat about things, but we do it in a humorous way. We don't really want to, tap into any deep feelings. And we do what we call masking, our feelings and our behavior and our emotions. And that's very hard to break through, because I recall having good friends on the department that I would see walking around, talking and chatting and smiling. but they were masking because a couple of them committed suicide, and none of us ever could see that in them. And, when you're left behind as a friend or a coworker, you're always wondering what you could have done or what didn't you see.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think, really building in more programs and more policies and practices that are not traditionally what we've done in the industry will really not only save and help heal people, but I think you'll find just it'll manifest into so much more productivity and the interactions that we have with the community. It will reduce civil liability. It'll reduce these instances and outcomes of things that we're seeing in the news, but it'll also just simply reduce what I call this place in policing too, where people are just unhappy. They're unhappy, they're depressed, they're struggling, and we just want them to go out and do the work. And we as leaders in the industry have to stop and recognize that without our people, we can't provide anything that anybody outside of our organization may need from us. And so it's just very important.
Yeah. And right before we started this call, you said something that was so simple. And I said, stop right there, because we started the conversation. I hadn't pushed play yet, pressed record. And you said something so simple. We're just people too.
Yeah. And I think we forget that sometimes. But I'm saying we, because even though I'm retired, I still work in the industry and I teach and educate police leaders and consult and coach them. We feel that way sometimes, that are we really people? Because we just go out and do this work, right? And sometimes it's just constant barrage of work, and you almost have to desensitize yourself a little bit. And then also the feelings from those with the loudest voices out in the world today, they see them as the branch of government called law enforcement, and therefore that's unfair. We just went through, one of the most precedential trials for law enforcement and for our country with George Floyd and, Officer Chauvin. And it is one of the statements being made that we all want people to be held accountable, law enforcement too. We want people like Derek Chauvin to be held accountable. And so I think what law enforcement and police officers are just asking is, in your local communities, see your officers as people behind the badge who are fathers, mothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins. They're your neighbor, they're your coach, they're your children's, classmates, parents. See them as the people that they are, and hold them accountable for the things they need to do, absolutely, but also see them for the people that they are. I think that helps with the healing for them too, to be seen as people and to be acknowledged for the good work they do. But that is not all that they do, and that's not all that who they are.
And that is so profound. See the person behind the badge. In a very simplistic analogy, when I'm working with my clients and groups, I'll say, create that story if you need to. If you don't know them personally, to say, hey, that's Jonni, and I know that, one of her family members is ill right now. Create a story. Like, same thing with road rage. I always say, it's like, I can be stuck in like stop and go traffic, and I'll be like, somebody cuts me off and I'll be like, well, that's Bob. I know he's upset and he's just not thinking straight because he's like rushing to the hospital because, his wife was just admitted. Or like, I make up these stories to personalize that person who just did whatever to me, so that I can then feel the empathy and compassion. It doesn't stop the fact that they cut me off, and it can stop me from feeling like a victim, first of all. And we are all connected. I truly believe that. So if somebody's doing something like that, and this is not to justify or to rationalize away anything, when somebody does something that needs to have due process, there is still that aspect of how broken are they inside that they could do that to another human being or creature, if we're talking animals, or right, and it's that idea that we are all people, we are all connected. And so thank you so much for that. I'd like to unwrap some things, please, here. Going back, and I'm taking copious notes here. So I'm busy writing away. So if people watch the video on YouTube, they'll be like watching me like writing away. I feel like I'm in this amazing lecture. So this idea of hard to let the armor down. And I know my father was in the military and suffered PTSD, and I've worked with veterans with PTSD and everything that goes through. And everything is like, it's like just about every single veteran I've talked to said that they didn't want to spill their guts to a stranger. So even if there were EAPs or something like that out there, it's like they're conditioned. It's like, suck it up, take it like a man, even if you're a woman, and just get the job done, soldier, or in this case, officer, or right. So it's that it's all part of the current training. As you say, it's all about, the current training system is all about turning you into that strong, confident warrior who's willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done, even if that means at risk to yourself. And so it can seem counterintuitive to suddenly start talking about softy things, frou-frou things of like yoga and mindfulness and talking about your feelings and right.
Yeah. So when I came on in as a cadet. I was 21. I came on in 1988, and there was no resources for you like there are today. It literally was suck it up, buttercup, and go do your job, period. And you didn't come in and complain about absolutely anything, nothing. Now, of course, not anything having to do with your mental health, but you didn't complain about anything, or you would get a ration of whatever was going to be dished out. And that's just what toughened you up. It was the, toughest hazing process when you first come on in your first year or two. But now we're looking at the evidence. We're looking at research to show that the most vulnerable people in the profession literally are those in their first five years, roughly, even up to 10 years of being vulnerable to this piece of depression, this piece of overwhelming, this piece of not knowing how to cope or understand or navigate. It still affects people with longer periods of time on, but again, we were also conditioned differently. And so this whole nuanced idea and area of all these things to us, for some of us, not all of us, it's like, what do we need that for? Versus some of us who have experienced maybe significant traumas, who are maybe educating ourselves more in this space and understand the ability of the healing that takes place. Great foundations and organizations who are doing the research, but also providing the practitioners who have walked the walk and talked the talk and been through the experience to go out and do the training, because we often resonate more with people who have had some form of lived experience that we've had, because there's this place of trust that we can start to create, right? We create, a circle of safety, so to speak, or psychological safety or whatever that may be in this common shared experience. And just really briefly, I had a line of duty death with one of my officers, been about 9 years now, and it was an extremely traumatic experience. Emotionally, I was completely shattered and shred to pieces, but I felt like I was experiencing that alone until I went and had an opportunity to speak to other commanders to share my experience, because at the time I was a captain. And in this forum, I'm wanting to be a part of it because I want to help them if they ever have to come across something so tragic. But a part of my panel was other peer commanders who shared their story of their loss of their officers. And maybe it wasn't exactly how mine was murdered, but it was still a loss. And as I heard them share their story, it created this ripple of opening up in the whole room. It was palpable to be able to sense the pain, sense the loss, the frustration, the hurt, also where we felt we might have failed or we could have done better. But we were all talking about this, but it was also cathartic for us on the panel. And it was still healing from those who were there, because even though they were a captain and hadn't had their own personally as a commander, They had experienced one as an officer. They experienced one as a supervisor. A friend of theirs on the department might have been killed in the line of duty, or they were called to help somewhere else. And it just created this synergy for us to have vulnerability where we might not have had that if somebody did not have that lived experience who was coming in to teach us or train us or to talk about it. So you're right. It's very important when you're dealing with law enforcement, military, first responders, wanting to get to the vulnerable pieces, those layers deep in the onion, where you want to be able to create that change for them in the healing.
Absolutely. And because this conversation and podcast is all about self-healing, ultimately, I want to leave our listeners on an up note, and I know that the awareness is beautiful. To me, I always say awareness is 80% of the battle and the solution. And so just that simple awareness of what our listeners may have as far as ahas. So whether you are an officer or a member of the police organization, whether you're a first line responder, whether you're a family member, so that perhaps this may have given you a different perspective because perhaps you're seeing the other side of your partner or your family member come home and perhaps they're masking or they're acting in a certain way and you don't understand why. Perhaps this will help, or the community and understanding that we are all people and all of these officers get into take on the job even knowing the risks because they do want to serve, they do want to protect. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. Is shit gonna happen? Absolutely. And on both sides, right? We highlighted the recent events of the last year, and you highlighted that you've had an officer killed in line of duty that was under your charge. So it happens in both ways. And so healing needs to happen on all sides. That's going to be a conversation for another topic. And it's also the hope. To me, I'm feeling hope. Number one, because I know that Jonni Redick is at the helm of this. And you are really spearheading and guiding the change and transformation that needs to happen. And you're initiating the conversations, which are so important to have no matter how challenging they are. And I really appreciate you taking that role. I know that you and I are working together, and it'll be that to look at ways where we can combine our backgrounds and expertise to help. And I will say, yes, emotional intelligence, resilience. To me, it's about giving the tools, as you said, that can become part of the training. So that is what Jonni and I are working on together, that we are creating these trainings that can then become part of the training to make every officer, every member of the organization, and other first line responders better prepared right from the very beginning to be able to handle whatever curveballs, trauma are thrown at them so that they can live and serve in their work and life without sacrificing their family, their relationships, their health. And they will have, like Jonni, you said you had to retire early because you were afraid you were going to die on the job if you didn't, like from illness and complications.
I mean, and I'm sure we can talk about that in another one, but
we will.
It was things like you said, it was the awareness. I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't take the time to really look at myself, that self-care aspect, because I had a duty. I had a duty to others. I had responsibility, and I continued to just push forward, not paying attention to my own trauma until I started to get very sick and had some significant outcomes. And I had to make a big decision for myself in my life. And my decision at the time, which was best for me, was to go ahead and retire so that I could do the self-care, could do the restoration process, and become whole again to begin to do the work that I'm doing now.
Yes, absolutely. And we will discuss that in more detail on another call. And it's knowing that change is starting
Oh,
and
yeah.
healing is starting. And I see the vision of it, and I know you do too. And just want to leave our listeners with the hope and the awareness that while things are far from perfect right now, we are all doing our part to create that shift of healing, both within, I always say the technical speak is intrapersonally, so within the officers, and interpersonally, like so the relationship between our officers and the community and their families and more. So thank you, Jonni. I appreciate you so much for being here, giving us your time, your expertise, and your experience. And I look forward to more conversations with you in the future, as well as our collaborations in creating this shift.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Irene.
Thanks for listening to Self Heal with Dr. Irene. Please head over to iTunes to subscribe and leave a review. By doing so, this will help us reach more people with our message. Be sure to visit www.selfheal.life to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our fantastic bonus content. And keep listening for more insights and tools to empower you to heal yourself and enjoy life to the max.